Welcome, avid romance reader and podcaster, Bree unabashedly.
Thank you for
Yay!
having me. I'm so excited to be here. I love romancing the story. So
Oh.
I told you, like, I'm a little fangirlish right now that I'm here. So thank you. Yeah, I'm excited.
Oh, well, I'm so excited to have you because I know it, like, we've been chatting about like having you on the podcast for a little bit. I'm like, I was on your podcast, the Categorically Romance Podcast. So I am super excited to actually now I get to be on the flip side of it and talk to you
Isn't that always
all about
fun?
it. Oh, it
Yeah.
is. It is. It's always interesting being in like one side of it versus the other
Yeah.
because it's kind of it's always fun to see that dynamic, how different that
Yeah.
dynamic can be.
Yeah.
So, in case listeners don't know, can you tell them a little bit about yourself and the Categorically Romance Podcast?
I feel like this is the hard part. Okay, so my name is Bree, and I live in San Antonio with my husband and my three kids and our puppy. We've adopted a puppy. We've had her now for like 2 months, and she is such a joy. It's a lot. All the fur parents out there, I get it now. I get it. But she's brought so much joy to our lives. I will be a first year sixth grade teacher this year. I'm really excited about that. So, like, life is just changing. And as far as the podcast, so the Categorically Romance Podcast, I have been hosting now for 2 years. And it is, we're going to get into this, but like it started out and still very much at the heart of it is like our love of category romance. So like Harlequin, Tooley Publishing, Entangled Publishing, oh, mostly Harlequin, because that's what I think a lot of readers associate category romance with. And it's so huge. So at the heart of it, that's what the podcast is about. And I love doing it. I love doing it so much. So
You've had a lot of changes in your life, but they're all been good changes,
good
right?
change. Yes.
Yeah. We
Yes.
love change. We love evolution as like he
Yes.
was
Evolve. Yes.
evolving into our final forms here.
Yeah.
Because that's kind of what I wanted to talk to you about because kind of like you mentioned, you've been hosting the podcast now for 2 years and things have maybe changed a little bit over the course of those 2 years. I mean, I know I talked about it on your podcast about kind of the evolution I went through with my podcast, and it's still
Yeah.
evolving even now. When I was on your podcast, that was episode 214. I talked about how I started, like,
Mhm.
and that was in the midst of the 2020 when we first started going into lockdown. And how did the idea for your podcast come about and when did it start?
So we started it. Oh my gosh, I feel like we started it in 2020, which sounds so weird to say because that was a year. But it actually started with a book. So my friend Sarah, she does YouTube. I have to shout her channel out. It's called The Bookish Knitter. So for all of our knitting friends out there that also love books, like she's got you covered. And she was who introduced me to Harlequin. Like I saw there were a few romance readers on YouTube at the time, but I felt like they were talking a lot about the same books. And so anytime I come across someone that's reading something a little bit different, I'm like, I want to be friends with this person. And so she was reading these like Harlequins, and I'm like, what is this? I did not know at the time, you guys. I was really new to romance. I started reading romance in 2017. And so we became friends. And we both were sent an arc of a debut by a Black female author named K.D. Richards, and it was a Harlequin intrigue. So, for anyone who's unfamiliar, Harlequin has two romantic suspense lines. Their romantic suspense line, which is more romance than suspense, and then their intrigue line, which is more suspense than romance. And I was like really nervous. I end up loving romantic suspense novels after I've read them, but it is a subgenre that I really have to kind of hype myself up to pick up because I'm a really anxious person. And so I go into this book and I'm loving it. And I like halfway through, I message her and I'm like, you have to read it. And I didn't think she was going to take me up on it because she's a very structured reader. If she says, I'm reading these 3 books this week, that's what she's reading. But she took me up on it because she must have been like, Bree doesn't read romantic suspense. So she's loving it. I have to read it. We both finish it. 5 stars. And so days later, we couldn't stop talking about it and thinking about it. So I messaged her. It's like 5:30 in the morning, my time. And I'm like, do you think Harlequin would ever start a podcast? Because it was like heavy on my mind, but I was like, I don't want to do something if they're going to be doing it. And she's like, I don't think so. And it just kind of started like, well, let's do it ourselves. So, I mean, we messaged a couple of like the publicity team that work with Harlequin. We're like, hey, we're thinking about doing this, but if this is something that you all as a company have planned, we'll back off. And they were like, no, go for it. And so really that's what it started with. We both loved this book. These books have really short shelf life, like a month at most. Sometimes you'll get lucky and the store will keep copies on there that they haven't sold for a couple of months. But, we just were like, this is a book we want everybody to read. So we need to be talking about it somewhere. So that is where it started. Sorry for the long answer, but that's it.
No, that's perfect because that's I love that you bring something a little bit different to it because you're right. So two things. When I didn't realize that category romance was a thing because I had always thought synonymously in my head, romance equals Harlequin. Like that was it. Like that was always in my brain because of we didn't really talk about romance books. My mom didn't really read romance books. I usually found them hidden back on the shelf in like Borders or like my library tucked away in its own little corner. I always thought like Harlequin was the just romance. That was the romance genre. Nobody else wrote romance but Harlequin. And that they had different lines. So I feel like when I listen to your podcast, I feel like I'm educated because now I kind of know the difference between the different lines that they offer. And you're right. If I don't pick up the Harlequin that I see at that time, it's usually gone. Their turnover is so fast.
Yeah.
And it's I got to grab it now or I might lose it. And then I can't remember for the life of me the title or the author.
Yes.
I just remember seeing the cover and that was it. And,
yes.
And I'm lucky if I could ever find that. It was maybe Billionaire Baby something.
Yeah.
I don't know. And there's a million of those. And I'm I don't know which one.
I still make that mistake too. I hate to say a mistake, but I'll be at Walmart. I'm like, I'll get this next time I'm here. And then I'll catch myself and I'm like, next time you come, it might not be here. So
exactly.
just get it. But luckily the library systems are doing a lot better with you can get the bundles. So they'll have 4 books from special edition that you can check out and you can just read the 1 or 2 that you want, or you can read all 4 of them. So it doesn't even have to be a purchasing thing. I think a lot of library systems are just so great with carrying them now. But yeah, like you said, if you don't catch it, if you don't get it when you see it, it might not be there next time.
Well, and something I have learned is you can make friends with your librarians and you can request books.
Yes.
Aha.
Librarians are superheroes.
They were amazing. And they always have the best information. They can always give me the whole rundown of all these books and be okay, well then if you're looking for a romantic suspense or you're looking for a cozy, mystery kind of thing, here you go. And then they'll lead me into this this heaven of all these Harlequin books, just stacks and stacks and stacks. And I'm just oh my God, can you please give me a recommendation? And they'll just pick one out of the stack and be here you go.
Oh gosh, yes.
I've met some of those librarians who are just amazing and they always have a good recommendation on the top of their head. So
That's the best. That's the
love,
best.
yeah, show love to your libraries. It's just amazing. It's just the most amazing thing. So when we spoke about the genesis of my podcast, Romancing the Story, I had a very different angle in mind. Kind of like I told you, I had kind of started it solo. And it just did not pan out at all. It didn't feel right. It just didn't there's a difference, I think, between feeling growing pains and feeling just not right at all.
Yeah.
And it just did not feel right at all. And that initial failure eventually kind of spiraled into the format that we see today. I get to chat with everybody. I get to ask them interesting questions about what they're involved with and how it's kind of come to fruition. The reality of going into a creative endeavor doesn't often meet our expectations. When your podcast began, did you have any expectations or imagine it evolving into what it is today?
Oh my gosh. Okay. Full transparency. Sarah and I were so excited. We thought this is going to be big just because Harlequin specifically has been around for so long and so many, there's math out there somewhere that every second there's hundreds of books being purchased all over the world. We call it Harlequin here. Overseas, it's Mills and Boon. We've chatted with friends in Brazil, Australia, even in Japan, the books get translated into Japanese and they turn them into manga and then they translate them back into English and send them over here. It's crazy. And so we just kind of got started. We did all the research. We read all the blog posts and watched YouTube. And it's start with 3 episodes recorded. That did not happen. When we started, we had 1. We planned on doing 3, but then we both had like severe migraines one day, and then somebody had to work, and it was just like, it did not pan out. So we just kind of went into it. We recorded an episode together, and then before we knew it, we had like 2 authors that were very graceful and like shared their time with us and did interviews. And yeah, like as far as like what it's become, like we thought, like we just knew like this is going to be big. But then as you get into podcasting, I think you can really quickly realize like it takes a lot of work, and you're going to do a lot of talking for a long time that feels like nobody's really paying attention. So yeah, it's been some growing pains. I think everything is a lesson. So just, I never try to look at it in a negative way. I'm like, okay, how can we learn from this? What can we do better? But yeah, like I think we had the hope that like, okay, this is going to be successful, but expectations, we didn't really, because like we had never really done it before. We both came from the YouTube space, and we knew it's hard over there. So we're like, we don't know. We're just jumping in kind of clueless, but we're going to have fun with it.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I was just so enthusiastic to do it. I kind of did the same thing. I kind of read a couple of things, and I was just like, all right, 3 episodes. Okay, I'm going to record 3 episodes. I had a trailer and 2 episodes. That was what I considered 3. So I was like, close enough. And I just got so excited. I just threw it out there. And then when it kind of like, nothing will humble you faster than throwing something out there for mass consumption and then just kind of having it fall a little flat. You know what I mean? And you're just like, okay, what do I do now? And, and I think we do. And I mentioned this actually in a post I think I put yesterday, and I was talking to most recently Meg Tatey, who had talked about her publishing journey, how it took her 8 years. And I
love that episode. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, it was amazing. And she's just so insightful and so lovely to talk to. And it was one of those things of like, we see all the author successes, right? Like all the picture perfect author moments on like Instagram or Twitter or social media, I think has really like given us this gilded view of like how we see what our creative endeavors should look like, right?
Yeah.
Like whether it's a podcast, a writing, or YouTube or anything like that, content creation of some sort. I think we go into it. So we go into this with this heightened expectation. And when the reality hits, it's much different.
It hits.
And yeah, it hits, and it hits hard, and it is unrelenting.
Yeah.
And we kind of, I think Megan had said that she took that information back and she revised. And I think that's kind of what we go back to, right? Did you just go back to the drawing board and said, well, we're just going to keep at it and we're just going to continue it because we enjoy it? Because that's what ultimately led me down the path of continuing the podcast, was that, I love talking to these people and I get a lot out of it because I'm hoping to write my own book one day. So I'm just going to keep pushing through.
Yeah, exactly. I think that now it takes some real self-reflection. And I one of my friends is big on like, remember your why, Bree. You need to remember your why. And I'm like, I just can't. I just want it to work. But like you said, like when it hits, it really hits. You're like, because I don't think people realize like how much work goes into it. Like if we're interviewing an author, we're reading a book, you're coming up with questions for content. There's a lot of prep beforehand, and then you record, and then you have to edit, and then you have to figure out like, okay, what am I going to post on social media? Like there's just so much that goes into it. So when you put that out there and it's like, it kind of just tanks, you're like, oh man, like, and I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of podcast listeners. There's actually a lot of podcasts, which is so weird to me, but like a lot of people, they don't really like the interview format. And I'm like, I was a kid in the 90s. We had like MTV, had like MTV Diary and all those like interview shows.
Yes.
I loved those.
Yes. 60 Minutes, 2020. Like we were always like, they were always
true Hollywood story. There was always some kind of like interview going on. So I'm like, you know what? I'm going to do what makes me happy. And at the end, I look at it too, like from an historical point of view. We have romance as a genre is so important, and there's so many amazing, diverse, inclusive writers that are doing amazing things. And it's like we have the opportunity to capture those voices. Like if you don't want to listen to it, that's fine. But like people are just now like really starting to study the genre. And I think what we do kind of contributes to that. And like, who knows, 10, 20 years from now, podcasts will you'll still be able to find romancing the story, and somebody can track down like your NaNoWriMo episodes and be like, listen to what Sarah was doing back in 2023. And she had this author on and they shared, their writing journey. The one Meg, who had this long journey, this long path to publishing. Like somebody may come across that like years from now. And I just think it's so important. So I think like just do what makes you happy at the end of the day. Like don't get caught up in the numbers and stuff. Like I think it's important, but if it's bringing you joy, the process of it, just stick with it. Just do what brings you joy. If people don't want to listen to that specific episode, you'll come out with something else and maybe that'll be for them. I don't know.
Exactly. And you bring up a great point, because whether you're creating a podcast or like writing a book, it's like it is a moment in time, and maybe that it isn't right for that moment. Yes, it isn't correct for that moment, but maybe like a year down the line, it's incredibly relevant and a lot of people find it,
Yeah.
So those are the kind of things, because I always think of like, especially during 2020, like when everybody was in the midst of lockdown, like how Ruby Dixon just had a moment. Like that girl just like skyrocketed. Like she'd been doing her thing for years.
Yeah.
And she still had she had a loyal following, but like just went like gangbusters with her books because people found them.
Yes.
And
some random TikToker, shout out to whoever it was. Like, isn't that crazy? Yeah.
Yes. And that's what I kind of think of, or I kind of think of like, all these episodes I've done in the past, and like some I thought would do really well. And they didn't. And others I didn't have much expectation for. They did amazingly well. I will always go back to the cozy mysteries. Like there's such a space for that. But I didn't realize how big of a space there was, and like how many people really love that genre.
Oh, it's such a good genre. Yeah,
it is.
I love that
so
episode.
Fascinating. Yes, I love it. Those episodes are so fascinating to me. So I love too that your podcast in particular is doing something so interesting to me, and I love listening to them because it is that this Harlequin romance at this very moment. This is the one we're focusing on. That's maybe just released or recently released. And I feel like it's important to capture those, since you mentioned it yourself, Harlequin is starting to be looked at in a way that is like literature, I think, and used as historical pieces of like, this is what literature looked like at this point, and how like it was very tailored to a specific audience back when, and how that has changed over the years. And how it's gone through such an evolution of itself. And I think capturing those moments is very important and historical in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, the authors across the board, I think just are, just brilliant. It's so crazy to think that like we read the book and we're like, oh, this was great. But like sometimes like it took them years to write that book,
Exactly.
And in the world of category, it just blows my mind because some of these authors will write 4 or 5 books a year. So it's like, you're doing this a lot, So I just think it's my friend Sarah used to say, like, they were intended to kind of be these throwaway books. Like you pick them up, you read them, you get rid of them, you donate them to the library, you pass them off to somebody else. But it's like, there's so much work that goes into them. So, I'm like, we have to capture that. We have to, as anybody that shares their time with us, it's just like, wow, I had the opportunity to talk to this person who wrote this book. And yeah, it may have come out 2 months ago and you might have missed the opportunity, but I hope it's back on your radar and you're going to go dig, and go find it.
Like you said, it was kind of written as a way to be throwaway, just like, but so were comics, and now they're very valuable. And, we use it as a basis for a lot of like, people call them our modern myths now, and like what we consider that. But I think too, like women's literature, I mean, it was geared towards women. It was written for really women in mind, now it encompasses everybody. It encompasses a large, like, piece of the population. Like any romance is for anybody, but it was really written with women in mind. And like, how often is things like geared towards women kind of thrown away? You know what I mean? And it's important that we keep hold of that and kind of like keep it in some kind of written format of some sort, and kind of encapsulate it so that it can be for the next generation of like, this was a thing. It happened. Like I was someone's Instagram post, and oh my goodness, I will give them shout out in the intro once I remember who did it the other day, but somebody was going backwards and reading all these like bodice rippers.
Oh, I
And like
love
from the
that.
90s, and like one was like a Three Little Pigs kind
Oh
of like
gosh.
a Three Little Pigs retelling, and it was so fascinating to me because I'm just like, wow, that was a thing that happened.
Yeah.
And she said it wasn't as bad as I expected. She says, yeah, there were a couple like tropes that and the evolution of tropes, speaking of,
Mhm.
like tropes, how they've changed over the years and everything like that. It's so important to have that categorized somewhere or put somewhere, either written form or, like you said, a podcast, so that
Yeah.
people can find that later on. So
Yeah.
even if you write a book and it's not for this moment, maybe it's for another moment down the line.
That's why we're
I
so cool. Podcasts are so cool,
I
especially the
know.
romance podcast. Just saying. Yes.
So, in an episode where you went solo, you mentioned co-host Aaron, shout out Aaron, was busy in nursing school.
I know.
I'm so proud of him. Good for him. That's amazing. Like that is a
Yes.
calling, and bless him for that.
I know.
I've had nurses in my family, so I totally get that. That is amazing. And that, like you mentioned, your OG co-host Sarah, was going to make an appearance on an upcoming episode. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. The episode that came out the day after. So like I randomly was like,
Oh,
I had already edited their episode together. They talked about like Babysitters Club and Sweet Valley High. Because every month we do a books club and we just like pick a theme. And we did Teen Dream May. And so we all read Babysitters Club, but I had like two other recordings that day. So I was like, could you please just do this one by yourself? And he's like, I got you. And so with the solo episode, I was like, I want to just sit down and see if I can do it. And I haven't had like like our podcast, it's usually us talking with somebody. And when you're doing interview format, like you get your focus is on like what specifically y'all are talking about. And so I'm like, it's been so long since we've had the opportunity to just sit down and be like, this is what I've been reading. And I really wanted to do that. And I was like, I'm going to do that. And I'm going to, chill out on the editing. It is what it is. And I'm going to post it today. And so I did. And then the next day, Sarah joined him, which it's always just so lovely to like hear her on the podcast. It was fun. Yeah.
well, and I have to catch up with that episode because I missed that one. I saw the solo one, so I was like, "Ooh, I got to hear what Bree's talking about today." And like it kind of inspired me. I'm not gonna lie, it inspired me because I'm like, I might try. It's been like 3 years since I've done the solo episode, so I might try it again just to give like. I love how you gave a status update for the podcast, like a
You
state of the podcast kind
should.
of thing, and I'd love to kind of share with listeners kind of where I'm thinking of going and like where kind of what's happening with the podcast because it is kind of it's kind of evolving as it
Mhm.
is right now. But you hadn't mentioned the co-host thing, which I thought was really interesting. I didn't know. I didn't know that you had actually changed co-host. Like Sarah was the
Yeah.
OG, and then Aaron came on board at one point. So, like, how did that work out? Like, how did that happen with a
Mhm.
co-host change? Like, did Sarah just say is a lot of commitment because can be a lot of commitment. I
It
know.
is. Yeah. Like I said, with Sarah, we were friends because of YouTube. And I knew the entire time, like YouTube was very important to her. Like it was always going to be her baby. But when the switch happened, she had some medical issues. She's always lived like with heart problems. And so it just got to a point where it was like, yeah, you want to shift gears, you want to like chill out, you want to focus on maybe one thing and, kind of not push the other thing to the side, but it's like time with her family just became very, very important. And I was like, got it. And so while she was in the hospital, Aaron started joining me more and more. And then before I knew it, it was just kind of like he's the new co-host. And luckily, she and I had a lot of conversations and laughs and tears offline, but it was like, this is just where it is. Like, because the podcast became my baby. Like I wasn't doing YouTube anymore. I was doing Instagram, but I was like, I can focus a lot of attention on this. Whereas like, I know your creative space is going to be that. And when you're not doing that, time with your husband, time with your mom and your cats is like top priority for you. So she's been so great and very supportive, and it's been so great having Aaron. He immediately was like, what do you need me to do? I'm here. And I'm like, I'm so lucky. So yeah, it was scary because a lot of a lot of listeners, especially a lot of the authors, just loved that dynamic between two girlfriends talking about these books. Because for a lot of them, that was their experience. Like they had a really close girlfriend and like they would sit and talk about presents or whatever. And so they loved that. And I was like, oh, I don't know how this new shift is going to work. But Aaron loves category too. He's a lot like we have the very similar experiences. He came to romance later in life like I did. So I think it's a new fun dynamic. Whereas Sarah had been reading Harlequin for like over 20 years. So we had the dynamic of like the reader who's been reading forever and then the newbie. Now it's just kind of like two very wide-eyed in love. We want to read all the things newbies together. So yeah, it was, it happens. I think if you're committed to it, if a shift have to happen, if a pivot has to happen, you just kind of roll with it.
Ooh, I like that. Yes. And that's what I always say too. I always kind of try to embrace change no matter where it is, because that might be, it's, you can't fight it, right? You can't fight change. So it's just kind of easier if you just kind of embrace it and roll with it and say, okay, what can we do with this then? Yeah. Right. Yeah. And it's kind of like, if you're like an author or even a YouTuber content creator, you have like a shift in circumstances, which I'm so happy for Sarah that she kind of had the presence of mind to say, I need to cut back. I need to focus my energy where it's really important and that where I get the most kind of joy out of it. And I have to, kill some darlings, unfortunately. So here's where I can do that, because I think as creatives, we have to, right? Because our time is so limited. And especially like with you say like 3 kiddos. I have one too, it's off for summer. So like you just kind of have to figure out how you can leverage that time and what gives you the most joy in doing it.
Yeah. How to make it work?
That's the name of the game right there.
Yes.
Well, and I love it because I see so many authors getting so creative. Just like as far as like I saw one author the other day just pop out her laptop. She says, well, the teenager did not invite me to the movie to go. So she sat in like the waiting area with popcorn and just was writing away.
Oh, I love that.
And I was just like, that is amazing.
Yeah.
I love it. I have to start doing that more.
Yeah.
So like just like randomly having my laptop with me at all times, or maybe like popping out my phone and getting notes done,
Yes.
So like I gotta be able to leverage that time a little bit better. So that's amazing.
Writers and readers, if we want to get it done, we're going to get it done. Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. I do that now in the waiting room. Sometimes I'll just like pop out my phone and be like, okay, I'm going to read this a couple pages real quick. Just waiting in line at the school to pick up.
That's some of the best reading time.
It really is. It really is. And do you believe, you kind of mentioned it before, but a little bit in the inclusion and kind of some of the diversity we're seeing now, especially in the last couple of years, do you believe the romance genre has changed since you started the podcast? And like how?
I do. I really do. And I feel like I'm kind of in a small section of Rome. I know there's so much out there that I don't see. Like a lot of my friends are huge into Kindle Unlimited and I'm like, tell me all the things. And I don't even subscribe to Kindle Unlimited anymore, but I'm like, just tell me because I'll just buy the book. Like there's entire subgenres out there and so many authors. I think like with anything, I think there's always tons of room for improvement, but I am happy with what I'm seeing, especially in the world of category. We're finally getting like Rowan Parrish was the first to have like a male romance that I've seen in category with their special edition line. And now we're very slowly seeing like the medical line is having its first female romance that comes out this summer. And it's like, what?
Fabulous.
Yes. And the cover is gorgeous. It's two Black women. I'm like, I mean, and I think in the States, like people don't realize like that is a lot because it's not a line you're going to see in the store, but Harlequin offers so much. So like the diversity is there, the inclusion is there. Just some of the lines you might have to do a little bit of digging. You have to actually get on the website and order those books. But yeah, tons more of like female romances coming. I just read a male romance by Sarah Taino. Puerto Rican male and Haitian male. Loved that romance. So, little things like that. And I love seeing more of the like ADHD, more talks of like just mental illness, chronic illness. Like I'm loving to see the wide range of like how inclusive authors are becoming, and just feeling more at ease, I think, of putting that stuff in there. It's probably like a lot of them have been living with these things, but maybe once upon a time it wasn't so cool or allowed to write about. But now it's like a free for all. And it's amazing because I think as somebody that lives with anxiety, I'm like, girl, I know what you're going through, So it's just so fun to see. It's really fun to see.
Oh, yes. And that was kind of one of the things I had been thinking about, because I saw it the other day. Someone had mentioned that they put a service dog in their romance. It was an indie romance, but it was a service dog in there. And actually, I had that talk with my kiddo, because we saw a service dog who had man, he was living his best life. He had goggles on. He was riding a Jeep with his owner, but he had a big old vest on that said service dog. And I mentioned that, well, it's a service dog. Do you know that we don't pet service dogs, right? Because they're working. And understood. The kiddo was very aware of that. But things like that you don't think about, because I have a friend with a service dog. Yeah. So it was things like that I feel like can be both educational and really amazing, as far as finding all this diversity and seeing yourself or your friends represented in in a book, right? In a book that's kind of released widely, even if it's indie or if it's category romance, because I love that they're including too, POC characters in the LGBTQ space for Harlequin, because that's really important. I feel like we don't often see that. It's usually specifically Caucasian or white couples that we usually see. So that's really amazing, because that's most of that's some of my relatives, some of my friends who are Hispanic or Asian or anything like that, because then I could see them in their culture, because that's what's really interesting to me, to see all that type of interaction, and then how they can still find a happily ever after. Because everyone deserves a happily ever after.
And the culture, in that one, it was so much talk of just food, and there was a lot of I love that we're actually seeing Spanish on the page. It's not, he said this in Spanish, no, it is actually on there. I will have to hit translate, because I'm I want to know what it says, So I love that. The small strides mean a lot right now. So
exactly. And especially because they do usually, you mentioned that in the indie, they usually start out in the indie space and they take slow gravitating to the mass market. But once they hit that's really important. That's a really important piece that it's really getting out to, with such a name like Harlequin attached to it. That's important.
You mentioned service dog, and I have to shout out a book. Now, guys, don't come for me. I can't remember the title, but it is by Sarah Adams, and it's one of her old indie. And the character in the book lives with seizures and has a service dog. And as someone who had, I grew up, I had seizures up until I was about 12. And so this was really eye-opening for me. I didn't know this was a thing until I read this book. And the service dog in the book knew, he kind of sensed when a seizure was coming on. So the heroine would lay down on the floor, and he just automatically was in work mode. He knew what to do. He kind of knew what to do, as she was coming back to. It was so eye-opening. And I'm this is why romance is so important. You would not read this anywhere else, I don't think. It was so good. And I'm here I am, 30 something years old, and I didn't even know this was a thing. And my little nephew lives with cerebral palsy, and I'm telling my sister, I'm you got to get him a service dog. You have to get him a service dog. So yeah. Romance is awesome. It's awesome.
Oh, yeah. Well, and just a quick shout out, because when I mentioned my friend has a service dog, that is actually, she's a friend of the podcast, and she's also been on the podcast twice. Catherine McClatchy. I think you listened to one of her episodes where it was reassessing your goals, your writing goals and stuff.
Yeah.
So she's a 5-time stroke survivor, and that's what her dog does. Her dog can tell her when she's about to have an episode, or that's awesome. To calm down before she does have an episode. And the really astounding thing, service dogs are so interesting, by the way. If you this is a whole tangent, but it's they don't know what he senses. they're not quite sure, but he senses it
He
in her
just
blood,
knows.
but he knows. He always knows when she's about to have either a migraine or possibly like it can grow into something worse. So he's very on top of it, and he will nudge her, he will alert her. And he's so good. He's so good. And it's been actually hard to replace him recently because she said she had to retire him because he was getting older in age. And that's a whole thing too. And he can't just be like a normal dog because he's a service dog. He's used to being of service.
Working.
Yeah, he's used to working all the time. So he has to he works with therapy, her husband, who works in like as a counselor. So he does therapy.
He's got to get reacclimated to just like being a dog.
I know. And it's very difficult for him. So it's like, it's a whole thing. And I love that romance is including that as part of that space. Because like, that's just something very eye-opening. I never knew either until I met like my friend, until I met Catherine. It's just, I don't know. I love romance. I love that romance does that. You know, who else, what other genre does that?
Yeah.
But romance.
Yeah.
And I know I've noticed that writing and publishing seem more accessible to writers than ever, right?
Yes.
Like we were just talking about that, the indies. Have you noticed common threads during all these interviews with authors? Any differences in talking to authors now versus then? Were you doing interviews? I haven't even checked that.
It's hard. I need to figure out, like, because a lot of our old episodes are just like, I don't know what Apple does with them after a certain point, but so like oh gosh, I remember us being so nervous. So like Sarah reached out to an author, Tara Taylor Quinn, who at the time I think was celebrating like, I don't know, something crazy, her 100th plus book. And I reached out to Reese Ryan and they both were like, sure. And I'm like, okay, so we're doing this. So really, I think it was just them recognizing pretty early that like, we're serious and love these books. It's totally genuine. The path to publishing is always really fun. I really love asking that question because you'll have those authors kind of like you had with Meg, who like it took years. They wrote multiple books, submitted them, and it was constantly a no. And then you'll have these random one-offs. Like we had this author, she's a South African author who now lives in Australia, named Bella Mason. And she's like, yeah, I wrote this book in a month and they accepted it. And I'm like, where does that happen? You know, so just the journey is always so fun. I really love, I think it's inspiring to hear those authors that are like, I sold my first book at 40. So it's not like a young person's game, or the authors who sent in like 5 or 6 manuscripts that were rejected before they finally got the one. And then it's always mind blowing when you have that one that's like, yeah, the first one that I wrote and submitted, it got taken. So I think it's just inspiring to see like everyone's journey is so different. I have been branching out just because, and I think we touched on this a little bit, but like you said, evolve, right? Like you have to evolve. And I'm really in this place now where like Aaron and I have talked about this a lot. Like it's kind of like, maybe we've reached all the category listeners that we're going to reach, right? And it's like you have the choice. You can either like continue to kind of stay stagnant, which I think is fine. Like I am so grateful for all of our listeners that are going to show up regardless. But I just also like really like believe in what we do and what we have done. And so it's like, well, how do we grow this? And it's like, well, maybe we do need to branch out. Maybe we do need to say yes to pitches from publicists that aren't doing category. Maybe we do need to just invite friends on a little bit more and just see how it goes. So that's kind of where the podcast is right now. It's like really experimental. I'm personally having a lot of fun with it. And so we'll just kind of see where it goes, because I love it. It's my baby. I do believe in it. But to be very transparent, like it got to a point where I was like, I can't justify us continuing to do this. We put a lot of work into this. And when it's just like you see those numbers, you're like, that's not worth my time. You know, it's like, what do we do next? We have to do something different. We have to show up differently.
Very true, because I know I see you guys like hustling all the time. I see you on the Instagram, on the Twitter. I see you like, I know you have, like you said, the book club and all that, the monthly book club. But like, and I know a lot of work goes into the interviews, like questions, reading, coordinating, everything like that. We kind of mentioned it when you guys interviewed me on the podcast, like, ooh, time zones are a thing. And that is always fun.
Yeah. So tricky.
Oh my God. So like, it's always, and like trying to find that space in there when you're so busy. So like there is a lot of work, and it is kind of this evolution thing, because I went through the same thing. For me, evolution is necessary for growth, and it can be surprising how it comes about. I can point to specific episodes like where I had moments of growth, either in the moment or in hindsight. Like I remember, like I never interviewed anyone outside my network, like anyone outside of that. And I mostly talk about writing, and I still do talk about writing specifically, like within these like indie, like in the romance space. I talk about like writing romance really, and how that kind of takes form with relationships. But Cindy had been the first person outside of my network who I knew personally. So that was like a moment of growth for like, oh, who do I reach out to and things like that. And I actually told a friend recently who was on my podcast, it's all about how you frame it, right? It could still lead into category romance. Like if we ever did an episode, maybe I can like read the same book you do and say like, okay, here's breaking down like the tropes, or maybe here's like the writing techniques. Like, you know,
we have to do this. We have to do it.
Like we could tell, like there's still like category romance as your heart, like you said, like that is so important. But there's just there's so many interesting paths you can take with it that are still, you know, essential to category romance. Yeah. You know, like what makes up a category romance in your mind? You know, like is there any specific things that do that? Like I get that, because too, you hit a plateau. You always hit a plateau, right? For a while before you kind of go back up. And it just depends on, I think, taking that feedback and trying to figure out, okay, what else can I do to keep hold of my vision, but to kind of elevate a little bit more where I go.
And like the spark of creativity has been like, I feel like this year has been it's been kind of slow. Like we slowed the pace down, which was great. And all of a sudden I was like, I can be doing more, and I'm ready to do more. I'm ready to take advantage of the summer. It's something about spring and summer that I'm like, let's just do all the things. So it's been a ride.
Well, and that's a big moment of growth I've had too, is just like trying to, and I love you mentioned this in your solo episode too, you were trying to get ahead for like when the busy season does hit, when school starts back up and you are in full teacher mode, and you are just like, Miss Bree is like on deck, you know, she is just teaching and busy. So lifing with them kids. So like, I get it. And that's something I'm trying to prep for too, especially for the holidays, because the holidays get crazy, and fall's always just like full of all kinds of stuff. So like, that's kind of like a big moment of like growth I'm having too. Do you ever have like the moments of growth on the podcast? I know we were kind of talking about that a little bit, but what do you learn from those moments?
I feel like that's where I feel like I am now. I feel like this is a real moment of like evolving and growing, because I could have easily just been like, let's just call it quits. Like I was kind of there, but I wasn't ready. There was a part of me that was like, I'm not really ready to let it go. I mean, I think that I think this can be really difficult for us as women, but just calling it what it is. We're good at what we do. Like, you're great at romancing the story. And I feel like I'm pretty good at the Categorically Romance podcast. And again, I think it goes back to that era that we grew up in. We were always seeing an interview. If it was Carson Daly on TRL, he was interviewing somebody. Exactly. You're just so used to seeing people having conversations. So it's like, we're pretty good at this. And I'm like, I can do this. I have to pivot. I have to not be afraid of like stepping out of what we started this, like with the intentions we started this to what it looked like. I have to like not be afraid of like doing something different. And if I lose people, I lose people, but hopefully it'll bring people in and they'll be inspired to go listen to the backlist and they'll stick around. You know, it's a lot of trial and error, but I was like, I won't feel okay with myself if I just call it quits without giving it one last hoorah and like putting in some work. And right now I've been having a lot of fun. I feel like my conversations have been less structured. Like the interviews that I've done, I'd say the last month, I didn't write any questions out. I just kind of like went in with maybe 2 or 3 questions in mind. And then as the conversation goes, I'm thinking of new things. And I'm like, okay, at max, this is going to be like 40 minutes. And it's usually like over an hour. And I'm like, oh my God, I carried this. I don't know how I did it, but I did it. So yeah, just kind of like not being afraid to step out, to do something different, owning that like you're good at what you do. I feel like that's where I'm at right now. Yeah.
And that's awesome because like that's something I always encourage writers too is just kind of like having like sometimes not being afraid to go outside the box. I always tell like interviewees, I'm always like, okay, we're going to ebb and flow with a conversation because sometimes interviews will bring out like some really cool topics. Like you brought up some
Yes.
amazing topics, like
Yeah.
for like how important category romance is. And it's very important. So like, and those are the kind of conversations that I like to dig into. I like to have like a little bit of like a little structure to it, but that way I can kind of, if it goes way off the rails, I can kind of bring it back. But like sometimes the best moments happens in the moments you're not expecting. Like they're
Yeah.
the ones that are unexpected.
Yeah.
So
Like I was so proud of you when you did that cozy mystery episode, which I know we've referenced a couple of times, but like it was so good. And I love cozy mysteries. I'm like, there's a lot of romance readers that love these. So I was like, I'm so proud of her for doing this episode.
It's one of my best playing episodes. And it's one of those that are way outside my comfort zone. But I have read like several cozy mysteries since then, and I get it. And
Yeah.
it's very much like in that same realm of romance. It's not quite romance, but it's like a kind of like the older, more mature, wiser sister,
Yeah.
to romance that, like she's like, yes, I love all that, all the sexy times and all the, the relationships and stuff, but there's murder. And I got to be on the case right now. So like, it's like definitely like where my mom is right now, like watching all the snapped episodes and stuff like that. So she definitely
Yeah.
is into cozy mystery. It is very much goes hand in hand. And I never would have known that if it wasn't for like my network too, who's been like super important to like helping the podcast.
Yeah.
So like they always give me recommendations. People I've interviewed before will always tell me like, oh, there's this person. Do you wanna interview them? They do great stuff. Yeah. And they know me well enough to where they know who my audience is and they know the type of person I am. So usually that works out really well. So always like listeners always leverage your network. Yeah, they're your friends. They know you. So like sometimes they have like really great ideas.
I think for the authors, like I just recently chatted with Maisie Yates, who's like big in category. She writes Presents, she writes Desire. She's like a big name in the cowboy romance world, but she just recently did a book that's a domestic suspense. She does it under a pen name called Ellie Banks. And it just like goes back to show that like we may be used to a writer as like a romance author, but they are interested in other things as well. And though their wheels may currently be turning of like writing a cozy mystery. So I just thought that episode was just so important. It was so fun to listen to, but I was like, there are so many authors now that are like known for their romance who are branching into women's fiction, branching into domestic suspense, branching into cozies, or who are cozies who are wanting to write romance. So I just think the crossover episodes like that is just so good. I loved that you did that.
Oh, thank you. Well, and I have to ask, what is domestic suspense? I don't think I've ever heard that term.
So that's what she called it. It sounds to me like she lives in Oregon. So it was like inspired by like a real life fire that they had there a couple of years ago. And she was like, after the fire happened and she had time to process it, it was like, how would this character have responded to this kind of thing? So it's like 3 different women and I guess like events that happened as this fire was taking place, like in their lives and like how the fire changed their lives. And like, it's kind of like, I guess, it sounds like very women's fiction-y with the suspense element. Like I haven't started it yet, but like, that's what I kind of took away. I was like, it sounds very women's fiction with like an overarching, very heavy kind of suspense element there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I like that. That sounds very fascinating. I'll have to listen to that episode, check it out. But you bring up a great point too. Like it is, because that's something I've heard from writers too, is sometimes they want to branch out, and even just romance writers themselves, sometimes they just want to branch out in different subgenres, right? Like they get known for one specific subgenre, whether it's like romantic suspense. I usually just write romantic suspense, but I really want to branch out into more like maybe I want to branch into historical romance some more. Things like that, that it's just like, how do I diversify? Should I diversify? But I always say try, go for it.
Yeah, go for it. We'll read
you'd
it.
be surprised. Oh yeah, you'd be surprised what the readers will go with you on. Like, like that's kind of one thing have noticed about specifically romance readers and romance writers, that, you know, if you give me a good storyline, a good romance, a good like relationship, I am usually on board for almost anything.
Right. Yeah.
Y'all can do pretty much anything, and I'm pretty much on board as long as I love the characters and, you know, it is going on a good trajectory. So like I am down.
Yeah. So, one of my favorite authors is I love Jill Shalvis. And so when I started with her, I started with like her Heartbreaker Bay series, like very much women's fiction. And it's interesting, like I think especially when you kind of you read an author's backlist and then you start keeping up with what they're coming out now, I'm like, she really straddles a line between romance and women's fiction. And I think that is great. Like it's still, she has her very signature romantic comedy element, but you can tell like she is kind of evolving into that women's fiction lane, but she still has that rom-com like on lock. So I don't know. I love it when they're like, I'm going to step like, Eloisa James wrote, I guess like a women's fiction novel like 2 summers ago under her name, Mary Bly. And I loved it. I was like, you need to do more of this. So I just think it's cool. You know, like you said, just try. We'll read it. Just try.
Exactly. We'll give it a go one way or another. So Bree, we've talked about so many awesome things. We've talked about especially like the Categorically Romance podcast and how amazing it is. So where can listeners find the podcast and how can they connect with you?
So I am on most of the socials at Bree Unabashedly, Instagram, the Twitter. I am on TikTok, but you know, I'll preface this with like, I'm not really there that often. So, but I do love getting on there and, you know, watching dance videos and things. And then the podcast, anywhere that you find your podcast, you can find us at the Categorically Romance Podcast. We tend to post mostly on Saturdays, but occasionally we'll throw a Wednesday episode in there, usually at the end of the month. And yeah, come hang out with us. We have some amazing authors and it's about them. It's really about them. I just get to like, you know, fangirl for a little bit, but it's about them. It's about their incredible books, work ethic. If you're looking for writing advice, if you're a fan of Romancing the Story, I may have a couple of episodes for you, you know,
there you go.
Come check it out. Like I'm like a lot like you. I'm nerdy about, tell me how you do this. You know, do you get up early in the morning and write, or are you a writer in the middle of the night? Like, what's your favorite program to use? Like, we're asking all the nerdy questions because we want more people to write books that we can read. So come check us out.